Welcome to the Principles of Performance podcast, where we discuss how to optimize your health, fitness, and performance. Drawing on decades of experience of working as coaches, consultants, and trainers to top performers, athletes, and teams from professional sports to top universities to the U.S. military, Eric DeGatti and Mike Perry discuss topics and strategies of how to perform at your highest level and be your very best. Join us and our friends and colleagues who are leaders in the fitness and performance industry as we investigate and challenge the most popular training, nutrition, lifestyle, and recovery protocols. And away we go. Here we are with episode number 57 of the Principles of Performance podcast. I am your host, Eric DeGatti, and I'm flying solo today as my co-host and friend Mike Perry is traveling. And I did not want to miss out on the opportunity to get this guest on. It's someone I haven't seen in quite a while. He and I spoke at a FMS summit about 10 years ago, and I've been following his work. And when I put together my list of people that I wanted to get on the show, he was very high on there. So I'm excited to grab him here. And I'm going to apologize for the long bio. And it took me some time to actually cut it down to this long because he's done quite a bit. Dr. Brandon Marcello holds a PhD in sports nutrition from Baylor, an MS and BS in exercise science from Marshall, and he's recognized as an author, researcher, and international presenter. Routinely speaks around the world on a number of topics pertaining to elite level performance, and his work appears in numerous journals, textbooks, and periodicals. And he's been doing this for about 25 years. He's worked with some of the most high-level individuals and organizations in human performance in the world, starting back to his time as a performance specialist at IPI, which is part of the IMG Academies down in Florida. And then he joined Mark Verstegen out in Tempe, Arizona, to help work with EXOS, or formerly Athletes Performance. And then from there, he served as a consultant with Draper Laboratories for the U.S. military and special forces, a bunch of Division I programs, international sports federations, as well as Adidas, Under Armour, Nike. He also served as the director of performance for USA Softball at Stanford University, and now he serves as a chief innovation officer for JAG Consulting. So you've taken about every dream job that I could think of, Brandon. So I'll have to pick something else now. Good to have you on the show.
No, I appreciate you. Thanks for having me.
So, like I said, I've been following your work quite closely, and you put out some really good stuff. And one of the things I like is you put out this tweet recently, and it was a great quote. Said, "One should not start with the assumption that a claim cannot be true any more than one should start with the assumption that a claim must be true." As much as we know, quote unquote, know in sports science, how much do you think we really don't know? And at best, we're working on an assumption.
I think we're working on assumptions a lot of the time, right? And I think that's okay as long as people recognize that we are working with assumptions. Because making one assumption is okay, but when we start stacking those assumptions, that's when we really deviate in the sports science world, when we're trying to improve the process from data to decisions, right? Because that's all we're trying to do is improve that decision-making process. And those assumptions can take us completely in the wrong direction.
So tell me if I'm on the right path here. One of the things I try to explain to clients that I work with is that we can't make these A to C jumps. And what I mean by that is A is this thing, a supplement, an exercise routine or modality or something like that, which creates B. And we know that B helps create C, which is gaining muscle or speed or so forth. But we can't assume that just because we do A, we're going to get C. Am I making a pretty good, a layman's explanation of that?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think the thing to remember is that there's two ways of looking at this, right? Like we want to look at human performance and human wellness, health as like it's a schematic of like whatever circuitry, right? That if you pass electricity through this route, it's going to turn this on, which will turn that on, which will cause this whole cascade of effects, right? That can be mapped out, that can be planned, that's engineering, right? Humans vary widely, right? We come in all different shapes, forms, sizes, backgrounds. We bring our experiences with us. We bring our own, nervous system with us. We are all truly an N of one, and we forget the human condition can change the way that circuitry is routed. And people may not respond the same way. You see it all the time with, like, medications, right? Someone takes a Tylenol doesn't work for me. You'll hear people say, doesn't do anything for me. Okay. Other people works just fine. Why is that, right? Why do some people are allergic to peanut butter and others are not, right? These are the N of ones that are genetics, our environment, our upbringing, nature and nurture, I should say, create that human condition.
It's funny you say that, because I've started to add a caveat at the end of some of my analogies, because I always try to give analogies to clients so they can better kind of
Sure.
grasp things. And we always kind of lean on those car analogies, right? Well, this is like your chassis and this is like your wheels, and we like to use that analogy. I said the only thing I'm going to put an asterisk next to it is that your car doesn't have feelings. You do,
Yes.
right? And so
Yeah. 100%.
that human brain changes a whole bunch of stuff, whether it's intent, whether it's habit forming, whether it's motivation. That's going to change a whole lot of stuff that we can't necessarily predict from one thing to the next.
Yep.
So when we talk about things we kind of don't know, how much do you think maybe that some of those answers lie outside of our little sports science silo, and not so much necessarily the answers, but the mindset and the thought process to get there?
I think it's huge to, we've spoken about this, right? Like, learning from other disciplines is critical. And many times these other disciplines have thought about these things, have considered these things, and have even answered these things, right? Um, but we get very caught up in our own world, and we forget to look outside, to maybe expedite the learning process, or to have somebody, solve our problem, or to give our problem a look through their particular lens, right? Like, the example I always use is, Microsoft Excel. So that has been used for years for people to write programs, right? Strength training programs. People will use Excel. There's some other things right now, but for years it was Excel. But one of the things that I did when I was at Stanford is I brought in the accounting department to give everybody a tutorial on Excel, because it's an accounting software. And if anybody's going to know more about it and can solve our problems and teach us shortcuts and improve the ability to utilize this tool, would be the accounting department. So leveraging on these people that have specific domain expertise, I think is critical and overlooked. But at the end of the day, saves a lot of time. And that can be applied to human performance too, right? Like, instead of relying on your own research to find something, reach out to a researcher who actually studies that, right? Find a sleep researcher, find somebody who specializes in nutrition, or find somebody, whatever the problem is, right? Um, I think it's best to be answered via them, right? Another example is when the paleo diet was coming out and gained a lot of popularity. I reached out to the anthropology department. Who's going to know more about paleo diet than anthropology, right? It was great that they could provide me their perspective and their insights on something that was just like, that has a scientific background. And they could say, yeah, in Peru, we have a lot of research that says that they did eat grains. Okay, right? And we went on from there. But it's just, this, a being able to your point, being able to solve a problem through multiple domains, or having people look at it maybe differently through their lens of expertise, I think helps solve the problem, in a unique way.
And I think even from the approach aspect, one of the things I love when I was going through do some research on your website, you have a section, one page of like stuff that you love to learn and think about. And not one of those books has anything to do with sports science, but I'm probably sure that you've figured out how to take something that applies to your sports science out of each one of those. So if you want to kind of talk about maybe a few examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, like, pulling from everywhere, I think is critical. And, like, what are we trying to do in the world of sports science, or whatever it is, right? We're trying to improve the decision-making process, right? But we're also trying to maybe attain goals faster. And that goal can be unique for everybody, right? And having a broad understanding of a lot of different things helps us achieve that, right? In terms of, like you mentioned, like all the different books, um, you can always pull something from somewhere, right? Whether it's, I was just talking to a colleague about this just recently, like, a lot of children's books that I was reading for, like, how do you teach your kid to be a good kid, and like what are parenting skills, right? Those things translate directly into like how you work with athletes, right? Like it's almost the same, right? Giving them choices, allowing them to think they're in control, right? Modeling good behavior, talking to them a certain way, giving them options, giving them choices, giving them feedback, giving them, owning it. So I think there's a lot of things, like you said, that would be one example that's kind of top of mind because I was just recently speaking with a colleague about it, right? Um, that I think really transcends everything. Like working with athletes is like working with kids, especially if you work with kid athletes. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the one that always sticks out in my mind, that I was at a conference that was really more about personal development and business stuff, and they brought up the 4 levels of competence, which Maslow made, popularized, and it was basically it had nothing to do necessarily with exercise, but it has everything to do. It's basically the chain of motor learning. You go from this unconscious incompetence, you don't even know what you don't know. You go to conscious incompetence, say, man, I really stink at that, but I don't know what to do about it, to conscious competence, where if I can really think about it, I could probably do it, to where we want to get athletes and people to perform is reflexively, and where they have this unconscious competence and they can go through. So that was kind of like this light bulb that, wow, that applies so elegantly to what I'm trying to teach someone to do a movement, whatever it may be, that's the motor learning pathway, and it
Yep.
wasn't necessarily intended for that. And so that's where I see those opportunities to like learn from other places. And that's why for every book that I'm reading on stuff to that's directly applicable, I'm trying to find stuff that may be indirectly applicable that I can pull in. I think Charlie Weingroff has a great expression he uses when we interviewed him. He said, I have 3 books. I have one for you, which is basically a science book to help me better do what I do. One for me to make me a better person so I can better deliver that. And the one to save us from both of us, basically a total escape book. So I thought that was a pretty cool approach. Um, so there's this interesting phenomenon in the last few years where quote unquote science, especially in health and performance, has become cool, which I would have never thought 25 years ago when I started. And whether it's the popularity of everyday people wearing wearable devices to track their sleep and track their HRV and their steps, or whether it's the successful rise of people like Doctors Peter Attia and Andrew Huberman. I was blown away. I went and saw him live at the Beacon Theater here in New York, and when a scientist fills the Beacon, sells out, like I had to buy him on a second tier market, like that's insane to me. How do you feel this greater public consciousness and awareness impacts the field as a whole?
I think it's good, right? I mean, it's a very good thing that it does show that science can truly be translated down and understood to the masses. And I think that's what people like Huberman and Attia are doing, right? I also think their approach is very earnest. I think their approach is very authentic. And they do a great job of like taking these things that used to be complex and seem to be sequestered only for the scientific community, and translating them down and breaking them down so that anybody can do these things, right? They distill the research very well. Yes, they have critics, and um, but I think for the most part they're making science accessible to the masses. The downside of that would be that it almost brings about this ability to skip steps. If I just get in the cold plunge and if I just get my morning sunlight, I will achieve health and happiness, right? And there are some steps along the way that you have to do in addition to those to optimize sleep and to optimize health and to stack the odds in your favor of living on your terms, right? With improved lifespan or health span. Um, so that's kind of the downside, is I think there's a lot of biohackers out there that use that term like a way of skipping around things. Like, yeah, I'll just get my cold plunge and then I can go eat donuts, right? I know they're really not saying that, but that's kind of like an extreme example of, skipping steps and just using one thing.
Well, I do want to circle back. I want to talk a bunch about sleep, but there's a couple things that you kind of lit the fuse for there. One on the biohacker thing. It's funny, we have a slide in our live course, and we talk about all of these habits are good for you. We list like 24 things, from like you're going to get up and you're going to get your sunlight, you're going to grounding, you're going to do your grounding, you're going to journal, you're going to do cold exposure and heat exposure, and you're going to meditate, and you're going to do all these things. And I totaled it up and I said that only takes 4 hours. And I said, now, if you're a coach, go explain that to your mom who's got to get two kids off to school, make them lunches, then get to work, and like, where are they fitting that in? Right. So we have to be realistic. If you're not the biohacker who's 20 something with who gets paid to do that for a living, some of those things are unrealistic. It doesn't mean that any of those things in isolation are bad. It just, to your point, I think it's not understanding the totality of where does this fit in terms of a grand plan.
Yeah, and understanding what your individual needs are, right? Going back to the human question, right? And that's everybody needs something different. What is that different thing, right? Some people need to work out. Some people need time to themselves. Some people need both, right? And I think that's where looking at the individual and saying, in what bucket do they need to be filled? Is it cognitively, physically, socially, or emotionally, or physically, right? Like, what bucket will, if I, which bucket should I fill to give them the best benefit or the greatest health and wellness benefit at that specific period of time?
Okay, now let's circle back a little bit before we move forward.
Yeah.
Going back to the popularity of some of this stuff, whether it's the podcasts or the books or the things like that. How much do you think that might be just right place, right time? Meaning that I don't know if these things came along when we started 25 years ago, if they would have caught the fire that we had. Because the time it was more of a meathead thing to go to the gym. At the time, like I remember even watching old videos or pictures of my grandparents, when they got to their 50s, they weren't looking to do, ice plunges or things like. They were basically looking to say, start, looking around the back nine and saying, and just get into the rocking chair. So I think it's the right place, right time, where you have a population that is not going to settle for that has a different expectation for their own abilities, as well as what their lifespan and health span should look like. How much do you think is right place, right time?
I think it's more, I think a lot of it has to do with society and social norms, right? You know, hot springs and tubs and those things are new here. They are not new in other places around the world, right? We get kind of in the United States of myopia a little bit sometimes, where we just kind of think about, well, yeah, this is like everybody's, this is really cool and this is new. And it's like, well, yeah, only if you're over here in the States, right? But other people have been doing it for a very long period of time, right? They've seen the value of social connections. They've seen the value of, hot springs or hydrotherapies or cold plunges, right? Um, I mean, heck, look at traditional Chinese medicine, right? Acupuncture is cool and accepted by insurance. Been around for thousands of years, but I think it's when society and social norms have evolved and changed to create that right time, right place, which you're speaking of, right? Because you mentioned your grandparents, the social norms back then, right? You graduate high school, maybe. My grandparents didn't, right? Um, you know, they worked, they had to drop out of school to work to support the family. That was normal, right? Children of immigrants. You have children, you have them at a very young age. That was normal, right? You go through this type of progression that was the societal accepted norm. And I think that's kind of where that's kind of being reshaped here immensely, and has allowed, again, to create that right place, right time.
It's like when clients say, "Oh, yoga is getting pretty popular," and I said, "Yeah, it only took 2,500 years to take off." Um,
Yeah, yeah.
all right,
Here
so
and here,
yeah,
right? That's the
exactly.
thing. It's like, again, we get very myopic and think about like, you know, yeah, look at the gas prices. It's 450, right? Well, it's $13 over here. Where do you want to be?
All right, so let's talk about one of your specialties and talk about the importance of sleep. And that's something that's kind of been a byproduct of this trend. It's gotten a lot greater awareness. So we often hear these common recommendations of how we can improve our sleep, but there's a lot to kind of tie all together. There's a lot of societal factors that run contrary to these points, whether it's our work schedules, whether it's school start times, being overwhelmed by technology. You feel almost sometimes like we're swimming upstream when we try to change people's sleep habits.
Yes, it can be, right? Because I mean, at the end of the day, things aren't, a client's not changing something because it's they're unreliable or it's not important to them, right? So if it's really truly important to them, they'll figure out a time and figure out a way, right? 90% of the time. But yeah, I mean, there are things with school start times that do impair with sleep, right? And we know that. The research is there to support it. I mean, at Stanford, when I was there, Dr. Bill Dement, who was the father of sleep medicine, passed away a couple of years ago, but he was the guy that discovered REM sleep. His influence on the campus was so profound that the earliest class you could sign up for was 9 a.m. because the university embodied what he wanted, right? And saw the importance and the need, and then it was substantiated in the research. That has changed, I've heard since then, right? But you think about it, right? Why do schools start so early when the research says otherwise? Why do we remove PE from schools when the research says otherwise, right? We know that. My wife and I were having this conversation, right, with our kids going to school, and we just put them in a new school. And one of the things that we loved about it was that they did activity, then academics, activity, then academics, activity, then academics, and they have PE every single day. And what's cool about that is, we know that physical activity primes cognition. So they're putting the students in the best place possible to accept learning. And it's the same thing that we do in our world in human performance, right? We want to put our clients in the best position possible to accept their training programs or accept their rehab programs, right? And that's really what it comes down to. So I think society, going back to that, has to start making some changes, which is always difficult to do. But I think eventually we'll see that change. But it is like swimming upstream many times, right? Yeah.
So talking about making an impact at schools, I want to talk about some of the impact you made at Stanford with nutrition, but let's keep going with sleep for a minute. One of the things that always stood out with sleep research is I remember there was about 10 years ago, there was a big article in The Guardian, and it featured a guy who was a former golf pro and betting industry guy by the name of Nick Littlehales. And he was a sleep coach that was hired by a lot of the top European soccer players and clubs. And he was working with Ronaldo, and his whole job was to basically go in advance of wherever that team was going to be playing and to make sure each player's room was set up to their specific sleep specifications that were ideal for them. So how have you seen high level sports embrace the importance of sleep with their athletes?
They've embraced it a lot, right? I mean, they're making changes. Every organization is different, right? So it really depends on what the tenor of the organization is, right? But there are many that are very forward thinking and are thinking like that, right? Making sure they're traveling at the optimal times, making sure, do they stay the night or do they fly the next morning? Making sure rooms are set up, making sure that, they're monitoring sleep, making sure that they're taking any sleep illnesses off the table, right? Deploying education to the athletes, who have kids, right? To help the spouse and the athlete, right? So they are embracing this. A lot of sports teams have been doing this for a number of years, right? But yeah, so people are embracing it, and people are seeing that its impact, and it helps too when you have people like LeBron James saying, "Hey, I get my 12 hours of sleep," or whatever it is he gets, right? I just made that up, but I don't know if it was like 10, 11, or 12, whatever, right? These big time athletes that talk about taking a nap and getting their rest, as opposed to the "I'll sleep and I'll die" type of mentality, which you have.
Hey, everybody, a quick break in the action here. Hope you're enjoying the show, and we appreciate you listening. We're working hard to bring you the highest quality content and best guests every single week. So if you could do us a big favor and go and like and subscribe to the show on whatever platform you get your podcasts on, it would be greatly appreciated. Be sure to listen at the end of the show also to find out where you can find out more information about our courses, as well as a special discount code for all our listeners. Thanks again, and let's get back to the show. All right, so before we move on from sleep, the slippery slope of sleep tracking. Talk a little bit about the accuracy and when it has benefits and when it actually could be detrimental in some cases.
Yeah, so that's one of the things which I think has also allowed people to put their heads around sleep, right? Is the fact that we can kind of quantify it now outside of a lab. And when you mention accuracy, how well do we quantify it? I mean, we're pretty good, right? We're pretty good at saying this is when you fell asleep. This is how long it took you to fall asleep. This is how long you were asleep. And this is how many times you maybe woke up in the middle of the night, right? They're not perfect. Every piece of technology is slightly different. An Oura Ring is going to be a little different than a Whoop. It's going to be different from a Ready Band. It's going to be different from a Fitbit. Going to be different from an Apple Watch. Whatever. Every group is going to have its own secret sauce of an algorithm, and with that algorithm is going to come variances of error. Right? They're going to get you in the ballpark. Right? I would not pay attention to any device's ability to tell you how much REM you received, deep sleep, stage 1, stage 2, right? Any of those things. Do they all have them? Yes. Why do they have them? Because it gives them a competitive advantage in the market. So why do the other people put them on their, product? So they're not left behind, right? So the only thing I would rely upon is really like sleep quantity and sleep quality. And even then it's going to be off a little bit, but I think it's close enough for the general population. I personally wear an Oura Ring. It's better than a Whoop. Not by much, but it's better. So I prefer that. And I look at my sleep every night, right? I see, okay, how was my sleep? How was my, I look at my nighttime physiology too, which, I take with a grain of salt. But yeah, so it does give you good insights into how long it took you to sleep, how long you slept, plus or minus maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes, right? And how many awakenings you had a night. So it's helpful. It can be hurtful, to your point, right? It can be hurtful if you obsess over it. Yeah, like anything. Then maybe you're not somebody who wants to track your sleep.
Now, one of the things in trying to ease people out of that obsession is to not look at things in isolation. And whether we've had these conversations about HRV with people like Don Moxley and Joel Jamieson, and saying like you can't wrap all your thoughts into one recovery score or one thing. It's more about trends, right? And it's about looking and seeing, okay, well, I have somebody who's not responding to my training, and then let's investigate your sleep. And we say, well, your sleep quality, your sleep quantity is terrible. Changing the training is going to be, so I just adjust to the fact that you just have lack of recoverability. So talk a little bit about how we shouldn't take snapshots and like what's a good trend, like what's a good, like over a week, over a month, like what are we really looking to grasp from that information?
Well, I mean, from a trend standpoint, it's like I just pay attention to, are your numbers going up or going down? And is the up or down a positive or negative number, right? Like, is my sleep quality going up? Good. That's a good thing. Is my sleep quality going down? Okay. Right. Now you need to add context to that from a daily standpoint, right? Because again, what does wearable technology do? It informs you about your behaviors, habits, and choices. That's it, right? So I wake up in the morning, I look at my sleep. My sleep was okay last night. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. Why? Oh, I stayed up late and watched the women's national team play in the World Cup. All right, so I stayed up till just past 11 on the East Coast. Okay, there's my context. I'm not going to worry about it, right? And that's the other thing, is you try to add context to understand why your physiology or sleep has been disrupted. That's valuable, right? From a trend standpoint, like, as you mentioned with the HRV, well, what is my baseline? Once I establish that trend for over a long period of time, we'll say a month, what is my trend? Where do I live? Okay. If it's me, I live right around 80, right? If it's my wife, she's consistently at 255. True story, right? And so it's like, not getting into the comparison thing, because that's very dangerous too, right? Is now, is my HRV going up or down? Okay, why? Right? Let me think about why it might go down. If I can't give a reason, I'm still not going to panic, right? Something happened, whatever it was, right? Could have been something that a noise in the middle of the night disrupted my sleep and I didn't recognize it, didn't wake me up, didn't perceive it, but it's enough to change my physiology and change my heart rate, right? Which could throw off my HRV. Or maybe I'm getting sick or whatever, right? So I think it just gives you, again, makes you curious. It should lead you to ask the next question. It shouldn't answer the question for you.
Well, I never thought I'd say this, but I have total HRV envy with your wife.
Right? She's going to live forever.
That's
255.
unbelievable.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
let's circle back to something I teased earlier. So you were the creator of a highly acclaimed program called performance-based dining at
yeah.
Stanford. Explain what that is.
So this is like one of my things, right? This is like, I always believe there's a better way. And the way we're currently doing things, I don't think that's the answer. We can always get better. So when I was looking at how they do food at colleges, universities, or anywhere, I'm like, there's got to be a better way than this red, yellow, green type of list of here's your foods, here's your red foods, here's your yellow foods, here's your green foods. I cannot stand that. The reason I don't like it is because, sure, there might be a time where a donut is going to be always red from a physical domain standpoint. From a cognitive, an emotional, a social standpoint, a donut could be green. Okay, let me explain. Like, if I take my child to have a donut on Friday mornings before school, what does that do for us? That creates a social and emotional connection and a cognitive one. The other thing it does, it takes me back, because my parents did that with me on Friday mornings. My mom would take me to school because she taught at school, and we'd stop and get donuts every morning, not every morning, every Friday morning, right? And so there's a benefit there from a cognitive standpoint. So doing that, not every day, not all day, but doing that brings about a positive change. So that's why I don't like the red, yellow, green thing, right? It's just, it doesn't really make sense. It's very one dimensional. So I was like, what if there's a better way of doing this dining? So looking outside of the silo, talked to residential dining services. We talked to the Culinary Institute of America. We brought in a registered dietitian. We brought in Stanford hospitals and some researchers there who study nutrition. We brought in their sustainability experts. So we pulled in all these different domains and said, we want to just do this a little bit better. So this creation of mine was like, all right, let's label foods differently. So we labeled foods based upon anti-inflammatory. We labeled foods based upon brain performance, enhanced immunity, so that if if kids are getting sick, it's wintertime and finals are coming up, pick enhanced immunity and brain performance. Those are going to be your preferred types of foods, right? If you're an athlete, maybe you want to go towards sports performance or anti-inflammatory if you're trying to recover, right? So that's how foods were labeled. So what we did was we brought this, it's almost like Chopped. Here are the foods you should be cooking with for these types of things. We passed it over to the chefs and let them do their job. I'm not telling them how to cook. I'm just giving them a pantry of items and telling them what each of these do. And it was great to sit in a room and say, cinnamon is anti-inflammatory and this and that. And he's like, so I'm envisioning like, a free range chicken breast, stuffed with pomegranate with like a cinnamon glaze, something like that. I was like, that sounds amazing. Great. You guys get it. So they tried it at one dining hall and it was a hit. Like, it was like super popular because, again, it just wasn't for athletes. It was for everybody because everybody's really trying to improve their performance. And to the point, it was so successful to the point where they had to actually tell students to go back to their normal assigned cafeterias by their dorms because they were just getting overwhelmed. It's just a different way of looking at things. So yeah, that was the whole performance dining thing.
That's very cool. Now, is this something that you've seen now start to get adopted in other places?
Yeah, and that's the hope, right? The hope is that others will take it, not replicate it, but iterate off of it and make it better, right? Because that's the whole thing. While that was very innovative at the time and unique, I knew that wasn't always just going to be the way to do it. So was there a way that we could make it better, right? Somebody else could make it better and iterate off of that to grow it, kind of like the car, right? The Model T was the first one, but it wasn't like, now look at the iterations we have from Mercedes and Audi and all these different things of, yeah, people are making it better. That's what you want.
My kids are going to be jealous when they hear this. One just graduated, and the other one's in college, and they get basically one step above prison food where
Yeah.
they are. So it's not good at all. And then you wonder why kids can barely stay awake in class. Let's shift gears a little bit, and this is something you've kind of alluded to as a theme throughout the show. Is you say that sustainable high performance is more than physical, and to truly achieve this, one must seek to elevate cognitive, physical, social, and emotional domains. Those are the big four. All are important, interconnected, and there's no hierarchy to them. Explain what you mean by this, and what do you feel kind of would be step one in kind of solving that puzzle for any individual?
Yeah. So the genesis of that, those four domains, came from some work that I was doing with our Department of Defense. They asked me to develop a framework to assess soldier performance. I said, well, I can't do that. I said, we could do human performance because at the end of the day, soldiers are human, warfighters are human. And that's, if we accelerate them and enhance them as humans, then the likelihood of them being enhanced as a warfighter is increased, right? Anything, right? Take a sport, better human, better basketball player, better human, better physician, better human, better stay-at-home dad, whatever it is, right? So I wasn't sure where to start. And it was like, okay, if I wanted to be able to just measure, if five random people were put in front of me and they said, which one's going to make a free throw at the half of a basketball game, who would you pick? I'm like, well, here's what I would want to know. So I started writing all these different things down and connecting them. But at the end of the day, what we came up with was that there are four anchors or four domains of human performance, right? And they're interconnected. So there's the physical domain, which we live in most of the time, right? In our professions. There's the cognitive domain, there's the social and the emotional. And because they're all interconnected, they all pull on one another. And we've all felt that, we've all experienced it. We've all been kind of, upset, maybe emotionally. And it's impacted how we perform cognitively, right? It impacts how we want to socialize. It impacts whether or not we want to work out or not, right? Or maybe it impacts our sleep, physical domain. We've all, we've all lifted weights and, trained and those types of things. And that has a positive impact on our emotions, or positive impact on our cognition, right? So all these things are interconnected and they all pull upon one another. So really, to achieve sustainable high performance, my point was that you have to consider all of them, right? We usually think physical domain because we can see it, it's tangible, we can train, right? They're getting better physically, but what is the detriment or improvement to the other three domains, right? And that's why I brought up like the donut example, right? Well, physically, it may not be your best bet, but it may be a net positive because you're boosting all three of the other domains, right? Sitting around you're Italian, right? Sitting around the table with everybody, enjoying good food is great, but there's always that one relative who's trying to watch their weight and they don't have dessert, right? Everybody else is having a blast, but that relative is just sitting there and they feel isolated, right? There's probably a negative, right, to that experience. But because they're so worried about the physical domain and not eating a piece of cake or a cannoli, right, they're missing out on really the good stuff. So, training should be considered in the four domains. Recovery should be considered in the four domains, right? Nutrition should be looked through via the four domains. just giving each of those consideration is what I was trying to say.
So there's a lot of gold, and I'm going to pick through the nuggets and some of them. First of all, I never trust anybody who denies the cannoli. First of all, second of all, there's a lot of overlap where this transcends to is to your point is there's a bunch of books that I've read in the last 6 months that they all kind of landed on the same place. They were all about longevity. There was a book called Ikigai where they studied people over in Okinawa who lived and thrived into their triple digits. There was Keep Sharp by Dr. Sanjay Gupta talking about brain health, but it really was overall health. And then there's Outlive by Peter Attia, and a lot of them came down on those same bullet points of all these people who thrived to that age. They didn't have a common diet, they didn't have a common exercise routine, but they had these things. They were active, they were social, they were doing all those things. Talking about, the Italian background in Sardinia, that's one of the big things. The town eats together. They all have their meals together, and so there is that social aspect. And like one of the ways that I kind of implement nutrition with kids, with like high school and college kids, is I say, if you can follow the 80-20 rule of 80% of the time you follow these kind of bullet points, the other 20% have whatever you want. And I said the easy way to do that is, if you do the math, if you should be having roughly say 4 meals a day times 7 days, that gives you about 5 meals where you can have whatever you want. And I said, so start Monday with 5 magic tickets in your pocket. And then if you get to Wednesday and all your buddies are going out for pizza, don't sit there like a weirdo and eat a salad and and a dry cracker. Like, have a slice of pizza and cash in one of your tickets and don't think about it again. Enjoy it. Yeah. If you get to the end of the week, blow, and you're going to a game or a tailgate or a party, blow your tickets because they run out on Sunday night. And so it allows it to be a little bit more feasible to realize that one slice of pizza probably didn't make a dent that much. And if it did, if it's that much of a difference, well, your 80-20 is now 90-10. Your 80-20 is now maybe you have no margin for error, but that's really in short frames. If I have an athlete who really has to make weight for something, or somebody who's really trying to dial in for one thing, but that's a really short window in terms of the scheme of things.
Yeah, and the net positive from a social emotional standpoint is probably outweighs the negative of the physical, right? It could even offset it, right? If you think about it, that psychological stress of not doing that probably did more harm than the psychological stress of enjoying the pizza with friends, right? And I think that's the key. To the point you mentioned, Okinawa, Loma Linda, California, Sardinia, all those blue zones, right, where people live into their centenarians, right? That the danger is that people cherry pick, right? And they don't consider everything like you mentioned, right? They don't consider that they eat together. The eating is good, right? But they pull Mediterranean diet. That's what they latch onto. They forget about the social connections, the sense of belonging, the purpose in life, right? All of these other things, going back to the 80s and the Ornish diet, right? With like for heart health, right? The big Dean Ornish diet. There were 5 components in that study. One just happened to be the low fat, right? But that's the only thing that everybody latched onto. There was a meditation component, there was an exercise component, and there was a social component, right? There were so many other components to it that just were dismissed, and people gravitate toward low fat, right? And that's where I think sometimes things get lost in translation, where like, oh yeah, Sardinia, don't they have the highest amount of resveratrol in their wine? That's what it is. So I'm going to take resveratrol pills, right? But they dismiss the other 6 things that you spoke about.
Now, the other thing that you said in there that I really kind of latched onto is you said better human equals better blank, right? So basketball player,
Yep.
whatever it may be. So could we also look at the tie-in between resiliency and performance and say that the more we build resiliency, the more we improve performance? And or are there some times where they can actually be antithetical?
Well, I think performance performance varies, right? What is performance? Everybody's going to be different, right? Or like I said, for the barista, what is performance? For the housekeeper, what is performance? For the stay-at-home dad, what is performance, right? So, understanding what that is the first step in the game, right? And that was one of the first things I had to do for the government, right? Is like everybody's talking about performance. I'm like, do you guys have a definition? Crickets, right? Nobody had a definition for performance. Nobody had a definition of readiness, but yet they talked about it like as if it was this known thing, right? And I said, well, what are we talking about, right? Not afraid to ask the question. But so I think that's where you have to get first is like, well, what does resilience look like? And what does performance look like? And are we talking about enhancing performance or optimizing performance? Because those are two different things. Enhancing is enhancing you and making you better. Optimizing is getting the very best out of this one particular point in time at your particular condition, right? Those two have to be separated as well because those are very different, right? If I'm a sleep deprived, stay at home dad, and how am I going to be optimized throughout this day? So how can I optimize my performance given my current state? It might be caffeine, right? It might be some exercise, right? Something like that. I'm not enhancing my performance. I'm just trying to optimize it. So going back to your point, I think we need to come up with a working and operating definition of what performance is and what resilience is. But yeah, I think the two could work against each other in specific times, given a lot of different contexts.
Well, and talking about times, it also, I would imagine, be more weighted during certain points along the timeline. Whereas if I look at the long-term athletic development of a specific athlete, that there's really a lot of enriched soil in which we can really enhance performance early on, and then as they progress through, then it's kind of optimizing. And then once they get to a certain point, when I worked, with professional and really high level athletes, your biggest job was just making them let them just keep going back out there and don't screw them up. So does that kind of change also along that timeline for an athlete?
Yeah, absolutely. Timeline, career longevity, where they are in their career will change that. Where they are in a season and day to day, right? Like, and you see this, the downside of this with our, military population, first responders, and things like that. These people are taught to be very hyper vigilant, right? And they're taught to be that way for a very specific reason. So when time calls, they can perform their job, right? You want to be hyper vigilant on a mission to wherever, right? You don't need to be hyper vigilant when you're at home on the couch watching the 6 o'clock news. You don't need it. So being redlined the whole time and not being taught the ebb and flow, not being taught how to downregulate, for the sake of performance, creates obviously a negative overall impact.
That brings up
Career-wise.
that brings up an interesting point that we've had this discussion with some other guests is the art, and I don't think it's spoken about enough. What you just said is the art of being able to manage states, and the art of being able to go from 0 to 10 to simmer at a 5, to be able to adjust your temperature and be able to do that. You look at examples in sports where the famous stories of Barry Sanders, quite possibly the greatest running back ever, would fall asleep on the bench when the defense was on the field, and then be able to get up and turn it on and go. That ability to kind of be on and off. And I need you to be, if I'm working with baseball, a baseball pitcher, I need you up until the second you start your delivery. I want you Zen-like. And then once that delivery starts, I need you to be an absolute raging lunatic until that ball comes out of your hand. So teaching those states, what are some of the ways to take, going back and tying it into your 4 pillars? What are some of the strategies that you found have been successful to get people to understand and learn how to manipulate their own states?
It's understanding what bucket do they need to fill, going back to the cognitive, physical, social, and emotional standpoint, right? Like, for some people, it could be playing with their kids. For some people, exercise does that. For some people, they like to meditate or do yoga. Some people like group fitness. But if you have an introvert, they're not going to want to do group fitness nor recover in a group fitness setting, right? They're going to want to go off and do their own thing, right? So that's that back to the end of one thing, and really understanding, what does your client, what does your athlete need? What bucket do they need filled, and how does that bucket need to be filled? With people, without people, right? Or whatever. So, understanding that and this is something I did for Michel Dalcourt Institute of Motion, when I did help them develop their 4Q recovery model. We looked at that and we planned out recovery protocols for introverts, for extroverts, for people that needed social, more emotional, more cognitive, more physical. And we did that for everybody to kind of educate those people taking that course on different methods, or to consider different things, maybe not different methods, but to consider deploying them at different times for specific individuals and their individual needs. That's because that's truly what personal training is. It's personal.
That's awesome. And you're definitely the rock going across the pond, making ripples all over the place in lots of different ways. So I want to know, as we kind of get towards the end here, what's next on the horizon? What's the next ripple you're looking to make?
So I mean, my job at JAG is Chief Innovation Officer. So like I'm having fun doing a lot of cool projects that relate to human performance that I've always wanted to do. And the thing I love about JAG and the founder, Joe Gomes, is that he loves it. He allows it. He's like, dude, I want you just to tell me what you think and we'll chase him down, which is fantastic. So yeah, I'm working on a lot of different projects, from recovery to data decision to just a lot of different things in the world of performance that can hopefully make things easier for people and to get people to provoke some thought and allow people to iterate on, again, like the nutrition thing, and figure out a better way. So yeah.
And then who's the end user with that?
Anybody with any human. Are you human? Yes, they're good.
That only narrows it down to a couple billion. So you got a pretty good shot there.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
That is awesome. So I could talk to you all day, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. And I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts with us. And this has been absolutely awesome.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. When I saw your name pop up, I was like, oh, of course, no brainer. Of course, I'll do this. So yeah, it was a pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, fantastic. Great seeing you again. And we want to thank you all for listening. And this has been the Principles of Performance podcast. Thank you for listening to the Principles of Performance podcast. If you've enjoyed our content, please like and share on your social media outlets, as well as subscribe and give us a review on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your preferred platform is to listen to. For more information on the Principles of Program Design courses and workshops, visit us at www.principlesofprogramdesign.com and follow us on all of the social media channels where we post new content every day. To save 10% on any PPD courses, enter the discount code PRINCIPLESPODCAST10 at checkout. If you have any questions we can answer or suggestions for the show, you can email us at info@principlesofprogramdesign.com or message us on social media. Thank you again for your support.